Okay. Welcome to the new quarter for Wednesday night. I thought Mark Taylor needed at least 5 more weeks to finish 1 Corinthians. So I guess I would gladly offer that to him right now. And so it's my quarter. And as I said before, when I teach class, I don't mind teaching class, but the biggest thing is, what do you teach? Because Peter just says, will you teach the adult class on Wednesday nights in the auditorium? And it's like, well, yeah. And then that's it. So the biggest thing is, what do I teach? Well, my lovely mother-in-law was kind of going through Gary's library, and she found this book on the book of John, which happens to be a 13-week class. So we're going to study the book of John on Wednesday nights. It's 13 weeks class, but we won't get through that because I think we'll have Thanksgiving in that time frame, and usually on the Wednesday night of Thanksgiving. Is that me? Oh, that's George. Okay. I thought it was me. But so I don't know how much we'll get through, and what we'll do with the book of John, obviously there's more than 13 chapters. We'll do an overview of each chapter. We won't go through verse by verse. We'll do more of an overview, and I'll have questions, 10 questions at each chapter. But what I thought would be interesting tonight, it's one of the things that when you teach a class, for me anyway, I try to study the Bible daily, try to be a daily Bible reader. But when you teach a class, you have to study a whole different way. So I encourage you to this quarter. Imagine you're teaching this class on John, and you can Google and do. But what I wanted to do tonight is I wanted to spend time looking at John the Apostle, the book of John, and when you Google and you search, and that's one of the things that my mother-in-law, I think she's trying to clean out her stuff, because she keeps saying, well, Gary's got all these books. And I'm like, yeah, but I got a telephone. I've got Google. I don't need Strong's Concordance and all those things, the big books anymore, because it's all on iPad or computer, and so I don't know if I've talked her out of that yet, but so I encourage you to study the book of John, and you can look at the same kind of things that I looked at. But what's interesting is looking at the Apostle John, who the majority of people believe wrote the book of John, and while it doesn't say his name in the book, it is referred to as the disciple, the loved disciple, and we'll look at that. He also wrote the book of Revelations, and he wrote the 3 books of John 1, John 2, and John 3. But what do we know about John? Let's talk. What do we know about John? Okay, he was on the inner circle, which means that there's certain things that happened, that it was Peter, James, and John, and Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, or Peter and John. We'll look at, throughout this study, we'll look at those type of things, but John was the apostle that Christ loved. I couldn't verify it, but we know that he's the son of Zebedee. He has a brother, James. His mother's name is Salome. One of the references that I read tried to put her being the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. I don't know if anyone else has studied that, or which would make James and John cousins of Jesus. I don't know, but we do know that they are the sons of Zebedee. James and John were brothers. John's the youngest. Some say that John was the youngest apostle. Again, I couldn't verify that. But we know that from the history of the first century, the different writers, that John's probably the one apostle that wasn't martyred. I guess there's some who think maybe, and we'll look at some of the things, because what's interesting, that I think sometimes we forget that the apostles were human also. One of the things that James and John were known as the sons of thunder. Why was that? Well, that's not the sons of thunder, but they wanted that. Yes, they asked for that. But yeah, they wanted to call down fire. They wanted to have the city in Samaria Samaria city, basically, and they didn't accept Jesus, and they said, "You want us to call down fire on them?" Where has that ever happened before? An example of somebody calling down fire. Yeah, in 2 Kings, the first chapter. It's kind of interesting when you read these. So Elijah, when you read it, Elijah just kind of up on a mountain, up on a hill. And the king at that time falls through a lattice, and he's injured. And so who does he call for? He calls for the God of Israel, which is a Baal. He doesn't call for God of Israel. He calls for Baal. And basically they say, "You're going to die. There's no God in Israel." So he sends a captain and 50 men to go to Elijah. And Elijah, they basically say that he wants you to come. And what does Elijah say? Yeah. And it cost them their lives because he called down fire, and that captain and his 50 men were consumed. Well, the king wants to be saved, so again, he sends another person, captain and 50 men, and the same thing happens. Now, the third guy that he tells to go, they say, basically the king asks who this man is, and he describes, let's look at 2 Kings. Let's describe Elijah, unless you know what his description was. Herschel, if you know his he says, what kind of man, and this is verse 7 of 2 Kings chapter 1, he says, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you and told you these words?" So they answered him, "A hairy man wearing a leather belt around his waist." And he knew it was Elijah. And so the king sent a captain of 50 with his 50 men. So he went up, and he was sitting there on top of a hill, and he spoke to him, "Man of God, the king has said, come down." And Elijah answered and said to the captain of 50, "I am a man of God. Then let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." And fire came down and consumed them. But the third group that came, this guy was kind of the third captain of the 50 with the 50 men, and the captain of 50 went up and came and fell on his knees. He says, "Elijah, man of God, please let my life and the life of these 50 servants be yours, be precious in your sight." So, but in 2 Kings chapter 1, we have where Elijah did call down fire, and it consumed 102 men, 2 captains and their 50 men. So, the sons of thunder, James and John said, when the city of Samaria wouldn't accept Jesus, let's just call down fire and destroy them. So, another time, was somebody make a comment? Yeah, I don't know why Elijah just, I guess he was comfortable on the hill and so he did go down with the third, but he still told him the same thing. No, there is no king of Israel, and you're going to die. And that's basically what happened. So, but why James and John felt the need to offer to call down fire and destroy them. But another time is, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes, is when Jesus, this is in John, the 21st chapter, and it's talking about how this is right after Jesus had been resurrected, and he was among the apostles, and it's where he talked to Peter about feed my sheep. Well, at the end of the chapter, he says to Peter, basically he tells Peter how he's going to die. So turn to John, the 21st chapter. So in verse 18, he says, "Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Then Peter, turning around, saw the apostle whom Jesus loved following, who also had lean on his breast at the supper. And he said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" Peter asked John to ask Jesus that while they were at the Last Supper. And Peter, seeing him, says to Jesus, "But Lord, what about this man?" Now, Peter and Andrew, brothers, and James and John were fishermen, and they were in business together, business partners basically. But now here at this point, when Peter's told how he's going to die, basically then Peter asks about John. What about him? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says, If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? So that's in verse 23, and we'll talk about the Apostle John and what this means later. But so he says to Peter, "If I will that he remains till I come, what is that to you?" Then this is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that were written. Amen. So John's the author of the book of John. He says here, after witnessing all the things that Jesus did, that the world couldn't contain the books because he did so many things. And when we talk about as books were written in the Bible, when we look at the first 4 books of the New Testament are known as the Gospel. And the first 3 books of the Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk a lot more about Jesus' early ministry and the genealogy of Christ. But John doesn't do that. John spends more time on the life of Christ. And if you looked at what the book of John is designed to do, it's designed to give us the knowledge that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's when we look at, as we study John, we'll see that his message is that Jesus, and we look at John 1, at the beginning of the book of John, John 1:1 starts with, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In his life, and in his life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. So John's book is probably one of the latter books written. A lot of people believe that he wrote it towards the end of his life, that he probably knew what was in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what he did is he wrote things that he saw, that he witnessed. And obviously, this is inspired Word of God. So it's inspired for sure. So we know these things, it's accurate, but it's the things that John saw. So John was an apostle. He was, we know his dad was Zebedee, and that his mother was Salome. And obviously Salome, their mother, was one that seemed to accompany the disciples. There's different times where we'll talk about that when Mary was there, and Mary Magdalene, and then they mentioned Salome, which is their mother. Anybody wants to add at any point? Herschel? Yes, he covers and the chapters 13 through 19 basically deal with 24 hours of what transpired in that time frame. We can read about the Transfiguration, that John was there, but John doesn't write about that. And John only mentions 7 miracles that he calls signs, and they're signs that show that Jesus is the Son of God. And we'll look at those things as we go throughout this class. Most of those things aren't listed by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The turning water to wine, that's John. The others don't mention that. So, let's see here. What else do I?
The only one that's listed in John that's in the other Gospels is the feeding of 5,000.
Okay.
That's the only miracle.
That's the only one that's carried over through the others. Yeah, okay. So if you didn't hear that, the only one of the things that's covered in John that's also in the others is the feeding of the 5,000. And that's covered by all 4. Okay. Talked about that. Okay, tradition has that at one point, because of, and the reason I read the last part of the chapter where Jesus says, what is it to you? If I want, he can be here till I die. Till I come back, I mean. And that people believe then that John never died. Some people think that he was like Elijah, that he was carried up. But so because we know that John died because Jesus didn't say that was going to happen, but he says, what is it to you? If I wanted that, that could have been the case. So some people didn't think that John had died. And after Nero, the next emperor, because John was now this is history writer that talks, it's not talked about in the Bible, but they tried to martyr John by boiling him alive in a vat of oil. So what it says when you read some of the, and you can Google these things on your own and study. So, but and again, this is history writer, not in the gospel. So, but it said that when John, and this either happened in the Colosseum or it happened outside of the Colosseum, and I haven't been in this, but apparently there's still a shrine there for this. And so what supposedly happened is that this emperor was going to have, because John was a Christian and preaching Christianity, he was going to have him basically boiled alive in oil. Now, again, more information than you need, but when we know what water boils at, and this oil probably was about 400 degrees is what it would take to get to the boiling point. And what's was said was that John is preaching as he's dipped into the oil, and he continues to preach. He's not affected by it. And so this doesn't affect him. And supposedly, everyone who saw that was converted. And that's what it wasn't Josephus. I couldn't read it in Josephus, but Polycarp, another writer, talks about that. And it's believed that John did die in Ephesus. We know he's gone. He gets sent to the island of Patmos. He was basically exiled to the island of Patmos. And then when he comes back to Ephesus, which is where they believe that he died. Now the other thing that's interesting, and this is probably why it's good that Christ didn't say in his tomb, because think about the shrine if we knew where Christ was buried. Because where John was supposedly buried, they believe that the dirt from his burial site healed people. And some even said that the dirt heaved where he wasn't dead. So when you think about how people try to worship different things, that it's good that Christ rose from the grave, and we know he ascended, and we know where he is, and that what we worship him here on this earth is his church, which is what he wanted. Because man will worship whatever other things they can, like this, that they actually have. There was two different sites that it might have been, the burial site, and they finally agreed, like in the 6th century, where it was.
John wouldn't let an angel worship him in the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
He would not. So
No.
He realized he was just a man and not to be worshipped, that God was to be worshipped.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, in what Jimmy said was, and when we study Revelation, which we won't, but when we do, an angel bowed, and John didn't want to be. So John knew his place. He knew that he was a human, just a man.
Well, they were horrifically barbaric. Some of the things that they came up with.
Yeah. Yes, they truly were. Yeah. Any other comments? Okay. Yes.
And I think the reason why people think that John and Jesus were possibly first cousins, at the end of each of the Gospels, there's a list of the ladies who were at the cross.
Right.
One of them named Salome, and the other says Mary's sister.
Right.
Instead of Salome. And so people are saying they think that
Okay.
that's the connection. That's where the connection comes, they think.
Yeah. Because one time it mentions her name, the other one says her sister. Right. Yeah.
It says it's Mary's sister.
Okay. Which, if that's the case, then, because one of the translations says their mother goes to Jesus about asking to sit on the right hand. Had a question to ask. Others say John and James said to him. So, but yeah, and if you think about if they were cousins, all we know about in Jesus' early life is when he went to the temple. So you don't know whether James and John might have been with him as the families travel. And but they were definitely, James and John were brothers. We know that James, his brother, was probably the first apostle that was murdered for Christ. Was it Herod? Herod kills him, like Acts 12, I think, in Acts. So the older brother was one of the first apostles that was murdered for Christ, and then John probably didn't die. They tried to martyr him, they believe. So, any other comments or questions?
He was also the apostle that Jesus gave his mother to
Yeah.
the cross.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that it references. There was sometime later where it mentions that Mary is with John, that John did honor that. And when we know that when Christ was arrested, now in the book of John, chapter 18, it talks about the Garden of Gethsemane, but it doesn't get into the same as the other. It just basically starts where Judas comes and they arrest him. But we know that when Christ is crucified, all the apostles scattered except for John. And John was there because that's where we see Jesus say to, "Behold thy mother, behold thy son." So we know that John was the one apostle that was still at the cross that followed along. Okay, and Herschel mentioned this before, nearly one half of the book, chapters 12 through 21, covers only the events of the last week of Jesus' life, his resurrection, his post-resurrection appearances, and then again, chapters 13 through 19 deal with a less than 24-hour period, from the Passover meal to Jesus' burial. Okay, let's see if there's any other fun facts. We know that, who were the two apostles that when Mary came back from the tomb was opened, that Jesus was gone? Who were the two apostles that raced to Peter and John? Who got there first? John. So, just that's free. Yes? Because, well, I mean, there's a difference between a disciple and apostle, obviously.
Well, we know that.
I don't know that Lazarus. We know Lazarus was a friend of the family, but we don't know that Lazarus followed along and was a disciple, and nothing tells us that. No, that's so easy. I'm going to have John Justice answer that one.
At supper, Lazarus wasn't there at the Lord's Supper.
With the Lord's Supper, yeah.
And so
It refers to him leaning on his breast at
John
supper.
was the one leaning on the Lord's breast.
Yes.
Lazarus wasn't there.
Yeah. So that's the commentary I would throw away then, Carly. Other comments? Yes. Yeah, there's about 6 different. I actually got that. So in John chapter 20, verse 2, it's basically listed 5 times. It's in John 13, 23 through 25. Later at the crucifixion, where he says to his beloved, his disciple, "Here's your mother, your brother, or your son." And then in John 21, 20 through 23. Okay. Let's see. This is just some differences between the Gospels. Okay, so these are the 7 miracles that are talked about in the book of John. In the 2nd chapter, we have water to wine. and that was Jesus' first his first miracle performed was turning water to wine, they say, but it was in John chapter 2. We have he turned the water to wine, and then in chapter 2, verse 23, it basically says, and that's one of the other things it talks about, is that in the three Gospels, it doesn't give a lot of references other than going to Jerusalem like the last week. But in the book of John, there's more times that it references that he made more trips to Jerusalem. But in verse 23 of chapter 2 of John, it says, and when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he did. And again, we can take this to the end of the chapter where he talks about if all the things that Jesus did were written down, there wouldn't be enough place in the earth to contain the books. And in verse 23, it just talks about all the signs that he did, people believe. And he didn't give us a lot of description of those things, but we know that Jesus did a lot of miracles. In chapter 4, the healing of the nobleman's son. That's in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we have the healing of a man who had been sick for 38 years. At the pool of Bethesda, he records that. Then in chapter 6, it's the feeding of the 5,000. And as Jimmy said, that's in all the other three Gospels also. In chapter 6, we have where he was walking on the sea. And again, we'll get into more detail of these as we get into those particular chapters, but this is just an overview of the book. In chapter 9, we have where he healed a blind man. And then chapter 11 is when he raised Lazarus. And I'm pretty sure that no one else talks about that other than John, of Lazarus being raised. And then again in chapter 12, verse 37, it says he had done so many signs before them. So it doesn't give up. It just says he did many more signs. And then in chapter 20, it has Jesus' resurrection. And then in chapter 21, we have where they caught the fish. 153 large fish is how the book of John, the miracles that Jesus performed in the book of John. And we know, obviously, that he did a lot more, but those are the only ones that are contained there. And what are contained there are enough to give us knowledge that Jesus was the Son of God, that he had the power to do the things that he did. Any other? Herschel?
John is the only one who mentions Peter by name as cutting off the ear of Malchus. That's thought it was because by the time John wrote, the other three books had been written, and he was no longer in danger.
Okay.
Neither the other three mentioned his name.
And if you didn't hear Herschel, that John is the only one who wrote and named Peter as being the apostle who cut off the high priest's servant's ear when they came to arrest Jesus. And again, it's believed that this book was written, John wrote his book so far later on that they couldn't go back after Peter because he might have already been dead at that time. Okay? Anything else here from the preachers to add as an overview? No? Okay. I didn't think I would get through this fast, so. All right, let's look at chapter 1 then, an overview of chapter 1. We already read of the first, where John basically, we can almost go back to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. We have in John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. How did John know Jesus was God on the earth? How did he know he was truly the Son of God?
He wrote this by inspiration, but also he's speaking firsthand.
Exactly.
He
He witnessed.
the resurrection, so he's writing his own personal observations, but he's also being directed by the Spirit of his inspired writing.
Right. So, John, while we know it's inspired, but John's writing first-hand account of the things, and he knew there's some who believe when we look at John the Baptist, and there's unnamed disciples who see Jesus, and John says that's Jesus, and those disciples follow him. They think John might have been one of those, but again, we don't know that. But John the Baptist it is referred to here in the book of John, and then because John the Baptist played a big role in what was John the Baptist's job? Right, to prepare the way for Christ. And we know that John was a cousin of Christ, or Elizabeth and Mary were related, so John and Jesus would have been. But John's purpose, his mission, was to prepare the way for Christ. He knew that when Christ came, that basically, that once Christ was there, it was going to be a different message. And we know what happened to John the Baptist then, soon after. So we have where John refers to, shows that Christ was with God from the beginning, that's who Jesus is. And then in verse 6, then it talks about there was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light which gives light to every man coming into the world. So, after John explains who Jesus was from the beginning, then he starts his book then with John the Baptist and John's mission, or preaching, and what John's doing at that point, which is preaching. And what did John preach? He preached that the kingdom was at hand, and that he preached to be baptized. And so he was baptizing, because where was he preaching? The Jordan, because there was much water. So John was baptizing, and he had the disciples who were following him and working with him. So in verse 15 of chapter 1, it says, John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, and he's speaking of Jesus here, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness we have all received in grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. So here's John the Baptist. He knew by inspiration who Jesus was and that he was a Son of God. Did the religious leaders of that time understand that? No. What did they ask of John? Who are you? Yeah. Did they think he might have been the Messiah? Not hardly. But they wondered who he was and what was his basically, there were people following John, so the religious leaders had to be aware and pay attention to what was going on, because they knew what was foretold. They knew what at some point there was a Messiah coming. They knew that. That was prophesied. And so they were paying attention to John the Baptist and what message he was giving in the kingdom of heaven was at hand. And then in verse 19, verse 19, it basically says, now this is the testimony of John, whom the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? As we just said. He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ. And they asked him, what then? Are you Elijah? And he said, I am not. They say, are you the prophet? And he answers, no. Then they said to him, who are you, that we may give an answer to those who sent us? What do you say about yourself? And he said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said. Now they were sent from there from the Pharisees, and they asked him, saying, why then do you baptize why then do you baptize if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet? John answered them and said, I baptize with water, but there stands one among you whom you do not know. It is he who, coming after me, is preferred before me, whose sandals strap I am not worthy to loose. These things were done in Bethbara, beyond the Jordan where John was baptizing. So as we just said, so the religious leaders at the time, the Pharisees, they were wanting to keep an eye on what John was preaching and what was going on with the people, because obviously there were people responding and being baptized, and they were starting to stir up a following of John the Baptist. But John said that it wasn't he, it's who's coming after him. And that now I don't know where Christ was when he says that he's among you, but Christ was at that time, maybe not in the midst right then, but he was in the city coming, because we know what happens here real soon. Then we have the first disciples. Again, the next day, John stood with two of his disciples, and this is where they think that John might have been one of these disciples. In verse 35, it says, again, the next day, John, which is John the Baptist, stood with two of his disciples, and looking at Jesus as he walked, he says, behold, the Lamb of God. The two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned, seeing them following, and said, what do you seek? And they said to him, Rabbi, which is to say, translated, teacher, where are you staying? And he said, come and see. They came and saw where he was staying, and remained with him that day. Now it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and follow him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. So Simon Peter, or Andrew, Peter's brother, what does Andrew do after he finds Jesus? Yeah, he goes to his brother. And what does he say to him? Yeah, we found the promised one. We found the Messiah. So he goes to his brother, and then Simon Peter comes. So one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, and that's where they think the other one that's not mentioned might have been John. And he first found his own brother Simon, and he said to him, we have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. So in the first book of John, we find John the Baptist teaching, baptizing, and then we find Jesus already starting to establish his ministry by having disciples, the apostles. Now when Jesus looked at him, this is Simon Peter, he says, you are Simon the son of Jonah, you shall be called Cephas, which is translated a stone. And Cephas is also known as Peter. So he changed his name. Okay, and then we have, still in that chapter, that Philip and Nathanael. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, and the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, and he said to him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? And Jesus answered and said, before Philip called you, you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now, there was any doubt in Nathanael's mind what just happened. He basically told him how much power that he had. That do you think that Nathanael was in eyesight of Jesus at the time, where Jesus could have seen him under the fig tree, or do you think that he was afar off? Yeah, he was impressed. There was no way Jesus saw him, so he was impressed knowing that Jesus then had that power to know where he was. And Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said, because I say to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So we're going to study the book of John. We'll get into some of the questions in chapter 1 next week. We'll do a little bit more of an overview of the chapter, and then we'll get into chapter 2. Any questions or comments about John the Apostle or chapter 1? Okay, thank you.